we're going to be calling up Ruben Andersson.
And who is Ruben Andersson?
Well, I'm going to introduce him.
Okay.
Well, actually, why don't I introduce him now?
Mm-hmm.
He's an anthropologist and associate professor of migration at the University of Oxford's Department of International Development. He's the author of Illegality Incorporated, or Inc., Clandestine Migration and the Business of Bordering Europe, published by the University of California Press. So Ruben, actually, if you go to Ruben Andersson, it's Andersson with Andersson, RubenAndersson.com. You can find a lot of his articles and things he's written, and they're really good, I think. So I'm not just saying that. Let's see.
You just said it, actually.
Well, what I mean is I say it with meaning.
Oh, okay.
Now we're gonna call Ruben, see if he answers. Hi, is this Ruben?
It is. Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes, you're coming in loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, this is I'm Stephen Robbins. I've been emailing you, and I'm on the line with Matthew Archambault.
Good morning.
Nice.
How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good.
And you're in the UK, is that right?
Yeah, I'm in London, where I still live. I'm moving to Oxford soon.
Okay, great. I read your little bio before we called you up.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I was telling Matthew, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm like enthralled by these articles that you have on your website. They're so well written and they're really, really interesting. So I'm
Thank you.
Having a little bit of a nerdy immigration fanboy moment right now talking to you.
It happens every time he talks to me too. So
that's not true. So your book, Illegality Incorporated, talks about something that you call the illegality industry. And I think American liberals or immigration nerds like Matthew and I are familiar with terms like the military-industrial complex or the prison-industrial complex, referring broadly speaking to large moneyed interests that are invested in things like war and detention. But tell us what you mean by the illegality industry.
By that, I refer to very much a similar set of interests and sectors that you were mentioning in the military-industrial complex. We have now, both in Europe, in the United States, and other rich Western and sometimes non-Western nations, more and more investments in border security. So these are the sectors I refer to principally as an industry because they actively participate sometimes in formulating policies on border security and controls. They've been gaining substantially from this in investments in new technology by governments. And we also have, besides the defense sector, benefiting from that, we also have many other sectors. We have the outsourcing companies, security companies providing manpower for detention, deportation, other tasks. And we have the border agencies who have grown massively in terms of financing, in terms of resources, in terms of personnel, both in the US and in Europe and other regions over many years. So we're seeing a set of interests converging on the borders and benefiting, gaining from this fight against migration we're seeing in the rich world, but they're actually not solving the problems. So the problems keep getting worse, the chaos keeps getting worse. And on the back of that, they can justify even more investments and politicians can keep on fueling and funding this industry.
Now, Ruben, would you also include lawyers in that algorithm as far as, I mean, me and Stephen, we do benefit from this system as well. I mean, it's true though, right?
Yes, it is true. And I include myself as well. I talked about the key security actors. I talked about the defense companies, border agencies, and so on. But there are also many other actors on the sidelines, as it were. And that includes us, academics as well.
I was going to say...
I didn't say to be too flippant, because we actually had a conversation on one of our immigration group websites or Facebook group about a proposition of public defenders being provided for detained immigrants. And I was surprised that there were many immigration lawyers who were really upset with this proposal because it would take away business. So, I think we all have to kind of, kind of look at this from, a total perspective.
I completely agree. We need to be quite critical about our own role in this, whether we are academics, lawyers, aid workers, or something else. Often what I've been doing research as an anthropologist in West Africa, North Africa, Spain, sometimes in Italy and so on. And I see this again and again. This is mixing and mingling of various sectors. You have NGOs, humanitarian groups, international organizations, researchers, all somehow getting involved in informing on or just working on migration in very difficult settings, detention, arrival sites, all sorts of settings. So I think we need to really think long and hard about our own role here and how we're contributing to this industry, as I see it.
Especially the anthropologists. I think we can all agree that's
especially us.
That's where it starts.
I think that's the biggest driving force.
Yeah, exactly.
I think so.
No offense.
It's all down to the anthropologist. Seriously, I mean, when I first started looking at this and I started thinking about this industry of border controls and fighting migration, it was really I was put on the spot by the guys I talked to. These were deported migrants in West Africa, sent back from Europe, who were facing up to me when I tried to talk to them, saying, "Look, why do you want to talk to us? What are you gaining from our misery here?" So they clearly saw me as part of a set of groups who somehow benefit from, or as they put it, eat from migration, make something out of migration.
Right.
Then we became friends, and I started to see their perspective. But that was kind of my starting point. I'm one more of these actors.
Now, you may have been paying attention to the news. I don't know how much of our news gets to you, but there is a TV clown person running for president right now in the United States. One thing that he is sort of made popular, it's sort of a right-wing meme in the United States, is, speaking of Donald Trump, of course, the idea that you can't have a country without borders. So without borders, and presumably he means secured borders, there is no such thing as a country. What would your response be to something like that?
Well, we're having the same thing going on in Europe. I can tell you, only over the past year or two, we've seen border fences popping up all across the Balkans and elsewhere to stop refugees trying to reach safety. The same rhetoric over and over again. Maybe it's just a bit more extreme in some countries than others. But this is a global phenomenon, fencing off borders, trying to close them down, saying we need to protect and secure the borders. That's happening all around the globe right now in different ways. The problem is that has never worked. It's never going to work. What I find curious in the American case is that we already actually, in fact, have massive amounts of border fencing in the US.
Yeah, but it's not beautiful. I mean, can we be? It's kind of ugly. It's kind of shoddy, and Donald Trump is going to give us a big, beautiful wall. So
yes,
let's all agree on that, right?
Of course, and the Mexicans going to pay for the whole show, right?
That's the best part.
It's even better. But the discussion keeps on being, look, we need to reinforce the border even more, completely ignoring, I think, even on the liberal side of the debate, the fact that, look, we've seen massive investments in more border patrol resources, in fencing going from 70 miles in year 2000 to 700 miles today, drones, radar systems, ground sensors, the lot. It's all out there. And still, the same measures can keep on being proposed again and again. Of course, they never solved anything. They just made things worse. They pushed people into dangerous areas, creating more chaos, more deaths, more rescue operations, all the rest. But it's good short-term politics in the most cynical way, because it tells voters that it's a simple solution to a highly complex issue.
No,
And that's very tempting to politicians.
I mean, one of the things I know that's kind of, gets a lot of news in Europe and here are the role of smugglers with these operations. Are we? Is it right to say that all smugglers are bad? Or, I mean, what is your smart thought on, smuggling operations?
Well, I rather get away from this, good versus bad smugglers. Smuggling is a business, like any other business, in a way, except it's of course illicit. But it grows and changes in instant reaction to the latest border control fads. So when you have a fence, it shifts its focus. Costs go up. There have been even some studies showing correlation between the growth in border patrol budgets and the cost of crossing the border into the United States. Very close correlations. So we're seeing higher investments in this business over the years. We're seeing more unscrupulous actors, professionalized criminal gangs elbowing out the sort of smaller cottage industry of coyotes. And similarly in Europe, you're seeing more and more predatory groups holding migrants to ransom, locking them up, because migrants and refugees really have no other resort nowadays than to use these smugglers, because the crossing has become so dangerous. It's a growing business that's grown as a result of this type of disastrous border reinforcement we've seen.
Now, I think
we do know that Harriet Tubman from the Underground Railroad, right? I mean, she was a smuggler, and in her day and age, she was vilified. So, I do think it's not black and white on this issue.
No, it's not black and white, and we should remember as well. Often, many migrants double up as small-time smugglers themselves, and they help others along the road, or they make a free passage, helping the smugglers. It's a really complex business with many motivations. And of course, when people seek safety and there are no legal routes to do that, like for the Syrians now stuck in horrible conditions, well, then you need some help. And yes, there are nicer smugglers, I suppose, and much more predatory ones. There's a whole range of people. The problem is, through the way we're fighting migration, sealing off the borders, we're creating more benefits for the worst kinds,
right?
The most criminalized kinds of groups.
Now, one criticism I hear a lot about the border wall, the Trump's beautiful wall, is that it's going to be super expensive, or that seems unpractical. But what you're saying is actually a different argument, which is that it doesn't work. So it's actually an exercise in futility. And that's not just you saying that. I mean, this is based on other examples. Americans tend to think that, like, we invented everything and we have the best ideas on everything. But in actuality, some of these things have been tried out before. So for somebody who's inclined to think that, if we can just build a wall, that will fix the problem, and you're saying, no, it won't. What is that based on? Can you give us a few examples or inform the people here about what's going on in Europe?
Sure. Can take an example of one of the first border fences built in the European Union. Two tiny territories in North Africa that are part of the EU, Ceuta and Melilla. These are Spanish enclaves from colonial times or before colonial times. So they are part of Europe, but they are in Africa. And they become a magnet for undocumented African migrants over many years. And I studied them. I accompanied border guards there. I hung out with migrants, aid workers, the lot. And what we've seen in these places, Ceuta and Melilla, over the years, is that putting up this huge fencing, triple fencing, rising 6 meters above ground with sensors, radars, razor wire, pepper spray mechanisms, the lot, and militarized border controls by Moroccans and Spanish forces. Yes, that can work for a short time in the most narrow sense. You push people away from the safer land border to the much riskier, more dangerous sea crossing. So you're generating new entry routes. That's been happening time and again over the Mediterranean, over the Atlantic. But then people tend to come back in the end once those routes are controlled as well, in ever more dramatic circumstances. You see people clinging onto fences, ripping themselves open, being pushed back violently by border guards, and they keep coming, they keep straddling the fences, they keep appearing in the media, and so feeding even more anxiety about migration, because look, these ragged migrants atop our fence are a danger or a threat to us, and so on. So this kind of drama at the borders has been generated by this type of border fencing, keeps brutalizing border controls, and that generates even more emergency thinking in Europe itself, and so feeds this in a vicious cycle with more investments. And that's the same thing that's been happening in the US, where people have been pushed into the Arizona desert away from the safer crossings, and now generating, of course, well, people like Trump then saying, well, we just need to put up a wall across the whole southwestern border. And this can keep on going indefinitely, really, because the underlying drivers for these types of migration are not solved by just treating the symptom and putting up a wall. You need to look at how you regulate your economies, what kind of labor migration is possible, what legal migration is possible, how you protect people fleeing from violence, how you intervene abroad. There's so many issues that can be looked at, and none of them are addressed by this simplistic border fencing.
Now, it's how is it, do you think, that we're able to forget so easily a time when I talk to somebody who tells me that they came to the United States undocumented, for example, in like 1993 or 1982, the presumption is that they just walked across, and they did so with relative ease. And in fact, a lot of people walked across at points of entry and waved at the the border crossing guard, and life was pretty much fine, and in fact, a lot of people are nostalgic for those days, while at the same time maintaining this sense that the border is a super scary, insecure thing. So how is it that the border used to be so less regulated, but people were sort of less radicalized about it?
Yeah. Well, that's something border guards themselves often point out to me, actually, when I talk to them. So in these enclaves in Spain, for instance, I talked to the Spanish border guards. They tell me, well, we didn't used to have this threat scenario at the border. That came when we put up the fencing. People started running across. You had a similar thing in the US, the kamikaze runs, they were known as, in California. People just sort of running past the border checks, border controls, the fences, to have some chance of getting in. So suddenly there's this emergency scenario happening. Wasn't there before. Another thing that's happened, and you have this confirmed in various studies in the US, is that the undocumented population in the US has actually grown on the back of this border reinforcement. That's the biggest irony, because basically people are kept in. People who before maybe came back and forth, they worked for a while on a farm in the US, they came back to Mexico. They can't do that easily anymore. They stay, they become undocumented permanent residents. So you've seen a growth in the millions in the undocumented population on the back of these multi-billion-dollar reinforcement of the border. That's the biggest consequence of this reinforcement.
Right.
Similarly, in the border communities, I was down in Nogales, actually, in Arizona and in Mexico the other month, and hearing about, well, in earlier decades, even the Border Patrol came across for their lunchtime tacos and went back up again. So you're blocking off all those communications through this fencing.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a great point, and I think a lot of people who aren't really familiar with immigration law don't understand about how the policies really enacted with, starting with Bill Clinton, have done more to just keep people here than to keep people out. And I know Stephen knows, any immigration lawyer knows, when you're looking at someone's history, you'll see maybe like lots of like going back and forth, maybe even in the early part of the 2000s. But you don't see many people coming back and forth. Like people now, like, will ask them, when was your last entry? It's always 5 or 6 more years ago. And it's never like, or I don't see very often, someone who's like come in like 2011, went back in 2012, came back in 2014, where if you look at their history, you'll see other people's, you'll see they came in 97, they left in 99, they came back in 2001, they left in 2004, they came back. And so, but really they're closing off, and also just the bars to reentry for unlawful presence has done more just to kind of keep people here and grow this underground community. And that's one of the biggest things that I feel we need for immigration reform.
Yeah, I agree. So I think we're seeing similar trends in Europe again. The more countries are trying to shield themselves off, sort of this fantasy of closing the border once and for all, the more you see this problem with people stuck in limbo. And again, like I said, this emergency scenario at the borders that just keeps feeding demand for even more border security. So we're in a pretty vicious cycle, and it's very hard in the public debate to shift it on to look what's actually happening. Let's not talk about this dream world where we can just close off ourselves from the rest of the world. Let's just look at what's actually going on at the borders. Listen to the people crossing, listen to the migrants, listen to the border professionals, listen to the aid workers, the people who know, the border communities, and you get a very different sense of what's going on.
One last question. Do you see, because it seems like in the United States there is people will say it has nothing to do with race or religion, but the reality is, and some people will admit this, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Mexican people look a certain way, and if you were to tell them that, you know, a European or a white person came the same way, they would have less of an issue with it. So I'm wondering if in Europe there are similar drivers, if you feel like that has anything to do with the conversation and some of these more draconian policies.
Yeah, no, it completely does. I think in both cases there's certainly racial elements to what's going on, fear of certain others coming into the country. In the European case, for years it's been about African migration, now lately the refugees from the Middle East, but completely ignoring the fact that only a tiny minority over many years arrived via these dangerous, dramatic routes into Europe from Africa. In Spain, you had these big migration emergencies in earlier years, but these were tiny numbers of people arriving. Surveys shown only about 1% of migrants in the country that arrived via these routes. It's a tiny minority, and it remains, even now after these large, massive entries last year of refugees, is still most migrants arrive through other routes, including irregular migrants, undocumented migrants who arrive on visas and overstay, and that's also in the US, that's a major reason for people becoming undocumented. But we're not looking at that. We're looking at the visible borders, visible border fences, visible migrants crossing those borders, and thinking that that's what we need to focus all our attention on. It's a much bigger picture out there.
Right. Well, Matthew, I don't know if you have any final questions.
Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on just open borders?
Well, I think in the debate as well, I'm a bit reluctant to get into it, because I think often we have this very simplistic pro or against migration, for open borders, for closed borders, and it becomes just a very abstract political discussion. But like I said, I think we need to look at what's actually going on. I mean, borders have always been with us in one form or another. They have different functions, not just to close off. They're also points of connection. And we could certainly boost that. We could enable circulation. We could do a lot more on that front. But I think we need to get away from this locked position and actually look what's really going on out there, and start to think of another way of dealing with mobility and borders. Because what we're doing right now is frankly unsustainable, and it's dangerous, and it's going to keep on generating big incomes for this border industry, as well as big gains for certain political forces. But it's not going to address anything. It's just going to make the problems worse. The fatality is going to rise. The drama and the chaos is going to keep coming.
And big fat incomes for immigration lawyers like me and Steven.
For the anthropologist.
And the anthropologist.
Exactly.
Yeah, big drivers are. Hey, Ruben Andersson, you can check out his writing in his book, Illegality Incorporated, at Ruben Andersson, that's ANDERSSON.com. That's right?
And you can take his class.
Website?
You just have to go to get accepted into Oxford University. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. I'll be teaching there from this year.
Easy peasy. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.